I'm David Ignatius, a columnist for the Washington Post, and it's my great pleasure to be the moderator for this discussion of a wonderful new novel. I've got my copy here to show all of you, 2034, with an interesting co-authorship of Elliot Ackerman, who is a novelist and a highly decorated former Marine who served 5 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. If you want to read the absolutely hair-raising account of the bravery that led to his receipt of the Silver Star and the Bronze Star, I'd urge you to read his memoir called Places and Names. Elliot is not with us today, but his co-author is our guest, Admiral James Stavridis. Admiral Stavridis, as I think many of you know, is the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, ran our NATO forces in Europe. After that, after leaving a distinguished career in the Navy, became the Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. You've probably seen Admiral Stavridis often on television, on MSNBC, commenting on affairs of the day. He's been for many years one of the people that I look to most for thoughtful commentary on what's happening in the world. So, Jim Stavridis, I'm going to call you Jim with your indulgence. Welcome to our conversation today, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much, David. And what makes it a real pleasure is simply being with you, someone who's a nationally known columnist, who's my colleague so frequently on NBC and MSNBC, and above all, who is a fellow novelist. I'm now allowed to say that. You've written at least 4 really terrific novels. I highly recommend, by the way, The Quantum Spy, which is in my wheelhouse of cyber. So, David, thank you for doing this. You're a dear friend.
Well, it's a pleasure, and I want to give our viewers a chance to begin to think about this book by asking Jim if he would describe the basics of the characters and plot of this novel, military thriller, but more than that, set in 2034. Give folks a sense of who the characters are and how you've structured the action.
I'll be glad to, and you're right to say it's a very character-driven novel. So in that sense, this is not techno-thriller where technology is the center of the equation. This is a novel where people are at the center of the equation. It's set in 2034. As the novel opens, you're aboard a U.S. Navy destroyer, exactly like the one I commanded as a young officer in my 30s. And you're in company with 2 other destroyers, clipping through the disputed waters of the South China Sea, and we meet Commodore Sarah Hunt, a Navy captain in command of this small flotilla. As the book opens, she goes to investigate what appears to be potentially a Chinese merchant ship that is in distress. Secondly, cut to the next scene, and you meet Marine Major Chris, call sign Wedge Mitchell. His call sign is Wedge because a wedge is the first and simplest tool known to man. He's a pretty basic guy. He's all about flying. He's descended from generations of Marine fighter pilots going back to the Second World War. He's up flying his Joint Strike Fighter, I should say, right on the edge of Iranian airspace, and suddenly loses control of it in that aircraft is forced down to land in Iran. Waiting for him, by the way, as it lands is Brigadier General Qasim Farshad, who is an Iranian Quds Force 1-star, someone who is a godson of General Soleimani. So those are the 3 initial characters you meet. And then the third sequence, David, is jump to Washington, D.C., where we meet the final 2 principal characters. One is an Indian American, Sandy Chowdhury, who is a Deputy National Security Advisor, PhD of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where I got my PhD, where Elliot My co-author is also a graduate. So there's a little Fletcher running through this thing. And Sandy Chowdhury receives a phone call. And the phone call comes from the fifth and final principal character, and a Chinese naval officer who is the defense attaché named Lin Bao. Lin Bao is complicated. His mother was American. His father was Chinese, obviously. There's always a little tinge of suspicion, but he's had a very successful career. And I really love Lin Bao because after myself 6 tours, I understand Lin Bao. He's driving a desk at the embassy, and all he wants to do is get back to sea, to be with sailors, to defend his country. This is a novel with 5 principal characters representing the nations from which they come. And the way in which their lives unfold brings the drama of the story as we head toward, as the title says, the next World War.
It's a chilling book, I should tell readers, in part because it's well drawn as a thriller, and in part because it's so close to the real life scenarios we're seeing with China, as the United States and China increasingly come into, I want to say, confrontation. And I'd like to ask you to take the two separately, Jim. First, talk about where we are today with China and the way in which areas like the South China Sea increasingly are contested. And then I want to talk with you about the new weapons that are emerging that are at the center of your novel. But talk first about the problems of today as you see them and the challenges right now that we have in our military standoff, if you will, with China.
I will answer those two excellent questions. Where are we in the present? Where are we going? But I want to begin very quickly by looking to the past, in the sense that what was in my mind as I went to my publisher, Penguin Press, with the idea of 2034 was Cold War literature, U.S., Soviet Union, rich Cold War literature. Red Storm Rising, The Third World War by Sir John Hackett, Dr. Strangelove, Failsafe, The Bedford Incident. These novels formed a body of literature that were cautionary tales that we could read and study and think about how terrible it would be if the US and the Soviet Union managed to stumble into a global war. So with that as predicate, what worries me is exactly your first question. Our relationship with China today is poor, it's headed toward bad, and it could become disastrous. Henry Kissinger, always good to align yourself with Henry Kissinger when you're talking about China. Henry Kissinger said just over a year ago, we're in the foothills of a Cold War with China. I would say we have ascended the mountain a fair way since then. We're pretty close to what I would describe as a Cold War, not yet as separate, as distinct, as utterly dangerous as the Cold War between the US and Soviet Union, but the trends are going in the wrong direction. We disagree with China about their claims of ownership of the South China Sea. And that may sound esoteric to some readers. You know, the South China Sea, what's the big deal? Hey, the South China Sea is half the size of the continental United States. Think about that for a minute. It's the size of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico combined. So for us, or for the world, to simply say to China, it's okay. Yeah, it can be territorial seas. We cannot do that. It will crater the law of the sea treaty. It'll lead to other preposterous claims all around the world. That's a significant disagreement, and that's why the book, the opening chapter, is set there on one of these freedom of navigation patrols. We also have trade and tariff disagreements. We object to the way Uyghurs, Muslims, are treated in China, forced into concentration camps. There's a crackdown against the agreement with Great Britain on Hong Kong, ongoing threats to Taiwan, which are ramping up. In the Himalayas, we see China launching attacks against Indian troops. All over, we see a very poor fact pattern And that's before we have a pandemic that began in China and creates a lot of lingering suspicion and concern. And of course, the shadowy world of cyber, which you talk about, for example, in The Quantum Spy. So it's a pretty poor fact pattern. And so when I look out 10 to 15 years, what changes? My concern is that these new weapons, offensive cyber informed by quantum computing, increased use of space, the ability to achieve hypersonic speeds with cruise missiles, all of these, we could go on, are coming rapidly to fruition in the possession of China. So those are two dangerous trends. China's military capability rising and our disagreements with them. You know, it's like two streams. It's like in Ghostbuster, you really don't want those streams to cross. They cross, in my view, unfortunately, around 2034.
Let's talk, Jim, a little bit about the technologies of warfare that in your book are very much real time, which probably today are just over the horizon. I have a feeling some of these are even closer than that, at least in prototype form. For example, in the very first pages of the book, I'm not going to give away too much of your plot, but in the very first pages of your book, as you say, your Marine fighter pilot Wedge loses control of his airplane. The electronic warfare ability to capture electronic control of that complex system and redirect it is overwhelming. How far away do you think that ability to penetrate what are fairly, well encrypted systems is in real life?
About 10 to 15 years. This is not going to happen tomorrow, but what could happen tomorrow is another event at the front end of the book, and that is where China effectively blinks the U.S. electric grid and our cyber infrastructure. I believe they have that capability today or very close to it. I believe Russia has that. I believe we have it. And unfortunately, more nations will evolve the ability to conduct those kind of very broad area cyber effects. That's coming sooner. And I hedge on that slightly because, as I've mentioned a couple of times, toward the end of this decade is when quantum computing will begin to really impact cryptography, security of systems. And it may be that defense will improve. But right now, offense is ahead of defense in the cyber world. So these are very real concerns. And by the way, others believe that it is much sooner than today. And I'll give you two pretty sharp-eyed observers. One is my good friend Neil Ferguson, who's a well-known international commentator. He wrote a column about U.S.-China relations, references our book, and the bottom line of it is, Stavridis has written a pretty good book here. He only got one thing wrong, the date. This will come sooner. So that's Neil Ferguson. More chillingly, the current admiral, who is the commander of all U.S. military forces in the Indo-Pacific, my very good friend, someone I've mentored for years, Four-Star Admiral Phil Davidson, in open testimony 3 weeks ago said he thinks the possibility of a war between the U.S. and China over Taiwan, an invasion of Taiwan, he said actually, could come as soon as 6 years from now. Now that's the officer looking at the highest grade U.S. intelligence and waking up every morning, analyzing it, thinking about it. He's talking about a 6 year from now event. So yes, David, you're right to say, how soon could this happen? There are days when I feel like it could be sooner. Having said all that, here's the bottom line. We still have time. We have time to reverse engineer this thing and avoid a war with China. And that's really the premise of the book, why I wrote the book, a cautionary tale that I hope spurs action that allows us to avoid the events described in 2034.
I want to ask whether you have a Chinese publisher lined up. I hope so.
Let me just say this. I said to someone asked me the other day, if you could force one person to read your book, who would it be? And I said, boy, is that easy. It'd be President Xi, because if I could just get a photo of him holding up a copy of it, I'd sell 300 million copies the next day. Think about that.
Well,
seriously, I do have a Chinese publisher in the sense that two of my previous books have been translated into Mandarin and sold in China. Whether they want this book or not, I don't know, but I hope so. It's a relatively even-handed treatment in the sense that there are no fundamental good guys and bad guys here. The villain of the piece is war. And if that message gets to China, I will be very happy.
I like that. That's a takeaway for me. The villain of any good war novel is war. Let me ask you a skeptical question from somebody who's been looking at these issues of China's rising power in my own work for some time. I'm haunted by my memories of the way in which we characterized the Soviet Union as a threat during the Cold War years. And as we look back, in every area except nuclear weapons and delivery systems, we radically overstated Soviet capabilities, including technological capabilities. And as I've looked at the Chinese in quantum computing, to some extent in artificial intelligence, I'm struck, and I'm asking this so that you'll tell me if you think I'm wrong, but I'm struck by the fact that the United States still seems to have quite a substantial lead in these technologies, that the Chinese are not 10 feet tall, they're not breathing down our necks yet, thank goodness. Your book is, a novel of the future. And so in that sense, we have time to get this right, that we shouldn't think that there's a sense of imminence. So I want to ask you, Jim, whether I'm being overly optimistic in that, or whether maybe a little bit of skepticism about China's military prowess is in order.
Can I broaden it beyond China's military prowess and simply say, as a nation, China is not 10 feet tall, the expression you used a moment ago. They have a significant demographic challenge. Their population is aging. As the saying goes, they'll become old before they become rich. They have a significant gender imbalance because so many female fetuses were aborted during the one-child policy when males were favored. Significant imbalance there. Hard to quantify what that will mean, but I don't think it bodes well. Number three, and you can score this one way or another way, but I believe the lack of democracy over time is going to create real turbulence inside China. And you see the edges of that now. Its economy, while very strong in many respects, has a superheated real estate situation, and the environment will require massive remediation. So China has challenges. And by the way, they don't have this network of allies, partners, and friends that we enjoy. Technologically, I think your assessment's about right. Other than, I think, in artificial intelligence, China is closing us very rapidly, and that may be the most important element of all. And here I would quote my good friend, I'm sure you know him well, Eric Schmidt, former chairman of Google. He just co-chaired the artificial intelligence report with another great friend, former deputy secretary of defense, Bob Work. If you ask them how close is China, they'd say in artificial intelligence, they're between 1 and 2 years behind us, and they're closing the gap. Some of the other things, they're maybe moving a little bit further, and I think quantum is probably one of those. But the point is the trends ought to inform how important we believe this is. And I think it is quite important that we address this.
We'll come back to the world of fiction in a minute, but I want to ask you, Jim, one more question about fact and policy, because I think many of the people who read your book are gonna try to think, okay, what do we do about the problems that are so vividly highlighted here? What do you think we should be doing as a country? What should the Pentagon specifically be doing in terms of research and development, in terms of procurement? It's become a truism to say that the kind of weapon systems that you commanded at sea and as Supreme Allied Commander are legacy systems. They're from different wars. They're not about the war you're describing in 2034, and that we just keep spending too darn much money on these old legacy systems. Do you share that view, and what are some of the systems you'd like to see us really investing in much more aggressively? And how do you think, obviously, we're going to talk about autonomous systems, but how do you think they should be used strategically so as to combat this rising adversary?
First, in the broadest sense of what should we do, here's a novel idea, no pun intended. We need to have a plan, a strategic plan for dealing with China as a nation. And here, if you look at the Trump administration, I think they got it right in the sense that they saw this increasing kind of looming tower, but they never created a coherent plan. There was, 1 minute President Xi is the BFF, best friend forever, down at Mar-a-Lago having a boozy dinner with our president. And 3 months later, there's a 40% tariff on Chinese goods, a dagger pointed at the Chinese economy. There were freedom of navigation patrols on the one hand. On the other, we were sort of easing back on some of our commitments to allies in the Pacific, notably the South Koreans and the Japanese. So no coherence to it. I think what the Biden team must do, and I believe they will do this, is fashion a whole of government plan that has an international component, allies, partners, and friends, and you're seeing them very quickly consolidate that. Secretary Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Secretary Austin, going to Asia. We settled these disputes with the South Koreans and the Japanese. We're consolidating the alliances, and notably the so-called Quad, not to be confused with the Squad on Capitol Hill. The Quad is the United States, Japan, India, Australia. That's a pretty interesting collection of foreign nations. Build that international piece. That's called diplomacy. I'll come to military at the end because that's the heart of your question. Secondly, we need an economic strategy that works with China and tries to kind of bend Chinese behavior without breaking it. We really don't want to break the economic interconnections. In the end, they can help us avoid a war, but we need to demand more fair trade and tariff activity. We need to reduce the theft of intellectual property. There's a whole basket of economic tools we need to play. Thirdly, we need to tell our story. That's called strategic communication, and that needs to be to our allies, partners, and friends, but also opponents, potential opponents. We need to tell our story in a coherent way, especially because we got ground to make up right now after the awful events of 6th January, when the United States effectively disgraced itself on the international scene and our capital was riven. And many countries looked at that and just shook their heads. We've got to explain what happened, tell that story, and convince people that we can work together. These are all hard to do, but they have to be part of a plan for working with China. Now, to your question, the military. No, we have not sufficiently begun to reduce our investment in legacy systems and increase to the new systems. And I think the problem here is, for decades, the Pentagon has kind of seen this as a simple on and off tool. on and off switch. It's not kind of an on and off switch, it's a rheostat. You got to kind of dial away from some of these legacy systems and take an aircraft carrier. It's vulnerable, it's a legacy system, but I can still see a lot of scenarios where 7 acres of sovereign soil and 80 high performance aircraft moving 250 miles every 10 hours can be pretty powerful. So we're still going to need those carriers for a while, but we ought to be moving, and here I come to the heart of your question, offensive cyber. Unmanned vehicles, particularly space, drones, surface of the sea and the land, under the sea, unmanned vehicles, special forces, highly elite, human performance enhanced teams. To me, David, that's the new strategic triad. When you put those three things together, the synergy of offensive cyber, unmanned vehicles, highly elite personnel, that's where we ought to be headed. We could talk about nanotechnology, quantum computing, some of the underlying technologies, research and development. But I think those three systems are where we need to turn that dial, find the resources in this $715 billion budget. Believe me, the money is there, and move it toward that rheostat, more modern systems, that new strategic triad, because I assure you, China is already there.
Well, I think when people have a chance to read your account of our vulnerability and the danger of miscalculating our way into war, they'll think more deeply about these new systems. So let me ask you, Jim, the power of fiction is demonstrated by what you and Elliot have done. Tell us a little bit about how you have written a number of nonfiction books. Your life certainly isn't that of a novelist. How you made a common cause with Elliot Ackerman, who came out of this distinguished military background, as you did, but then found a life as a novelist and has written a number of highly praised novels drawn from his experiences in combat and around the world. How did you two come together in this project, and what was it like for an admiral working with a former Marine infantry leader, as you know, when he got into fights about which character should say what? How'd you work those out?
Yeah, no, this is actually, I think, a really fun story. So I had written 9 books of nonfiction. Several were bestsellers, did very well. One about the human character called Sailing True North. One about the oceans called Sea Power, the history and geopolitics of the world's oceans. Random House, big publisher. And I've always wanted to write a novel. Right now in my library, I have 5,000 books here, 3,000 are novels. So I love fiction. So I went to my editor, a guy named Scott Moyers, and I said, Scott, I'm ready to write a novel. And Scott said, quote, Admiral, you're a great guy and you're a good writer, but you're not a novelist. And that just broke my little heart. And I said, I was like a 10-year-old. I said, yes, I am. I can write a novel. I know how to write a novel. I've read so many novels. So he said, all right, go back and give me a detailed outline and write a sample chapter. So I did all that. And I went back and he dutifully read it all. And he called me up and he said, Admiral, you are a great guy, but you are not a novelist. But I know a novelist. And so that's how this unlikely pairing, if you will, began, because my editor said, let's put you with a very experienced novelist who understands deeply how to create a character, how fit and finish a plot come together, how to use symbolism. So A, I was very lucky to get paired with Elliot Ackerman. B, we're both graduates of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. We share that bond together. C, as you point out, both careers, if you will, mine much longer, but careers in the military. So there was a lot of agreement and sensibility. And here I'm going to disappoint you. We never had a serious disagreement about really anything in the novel other than one thing. And that was the degree to which we wanted to kind of put, if you will, futuristic technologies into the novel. And I was the one saying to Eliot, you know, we've got a character reading a newspaper. No one's going to be reading a paper newspaper in 2034. We have a character who arrives in a taxi cab with a driver who's honking his or her horn. I said, there aren't going to be drivers of taxi cabs. It's going to be driverless by 2034. And, you know, Eliot was very firm that we don't want to make this a techno thriller. We don't want to distract with the technology. So the young Marine captain beat the old grizzled admiral on the one disagreement. He talked me out of it. So that's the story of me and Eliot, who we become very fast friends. And by the way, I can share this. We have agreed to a 2-book sequel with Penguin Press Random House, which will drive the story further into this 21st century. The next one will be 2054, and the one after that, I think, will be 2084, a bit of homage to 1984. So the team will continue to work together.
That's fascinating. It's good news for readers. I would be interested as a novelist myself. I've written 11 novels, and I think many people watching would also be interested in just the question of technique, whether you would write a chapter, then Eliot would write a chapter, whether one of you would do a kind of treatment of the book as a whole and then bounce it back with the other. What was the writing process like, day to day, week to week?
We made it up as we went along, and as you know, there are very few examples of novelists working together effectively. I could name a few, but very, very few. I created the idea. I wrote the first, if you will, treatment of the book. Then I would be in charge of writing the detailed outline, and my particular responsibility, which won't surprise you, would be the geopolitics and the technology. Eliot was more on the character side of it, had more of a voice in the creation of the characters, although I could walk you through the characters and show you, okay, there's Stavridis in that one, there's Eliot in this one's neither one of us. But we sort of divided along those lines. More often than not, Eliot would do an actual draft of a section. I would do very detailed commentary, which became, in effect, almost a second draft. We would go back and forth, and we did it chapter by chapter. There are only 6 chapters in the book. You know, we knew we didn't want to write, War and Peace with 100 characters and an index of everybody's name. We didn't want to write Winds of War and War and Remembrance, as good as both those books are. We didn't want to write Red Storm Rising, which is almost 700 pages, the Cold War novel by Tom Clancy. We wanted to write a pretty tight novel with a relatively narrow frame and let each of the characters come on stage and kind of tell their story from their nation's perspective. You really, I hope, get a feel for how the Iranians feel. Why is Iran drawn so close to China by 2034? Well, by the way, I'll point out, we wrote this well over a year ago. As you know, the cycle, it's about a year from the time you turn in a manuscript till the novel comes out. So we turned in a manuscript a year ago. We had to change it, by the way, when General Soleimani was killed. We had to go back and rewrite it because he was still alive in the original draft of this thing. And we also, a year and a half ago, were thinking Iran and China coming closer and closer. What happened 3 weeks ago? $400 billion deal signed between Iran and China. We would just go back and forth, kind of do a chapter, try and roll with the punches of what was happening and keep looking forward.
I should note one of the things that I like about the structure of this book is that it is in tight time slices, each with a place and a time. We'd say in my business a dateline. I think that's a useful way to write this kind of book. I want to remind viewers that you can ask questions of Admiral Stavridis about his book if you go to the chat function. And I'm going to start off with one that's been sent in by Clay, but in part to invite other people in the remaining 10 minutes or so that we have to do the same. Clay wants to know, did you write this novel as a warning or more to entertain readers? In other words, does this have a policy intent, or does it have an entertainment intent, or some mix of both?
I think you'd probably get two different answers from the Admiral and Captain Elliot Ackerman, U.S. Marine Corps. I am more of the mind that this, for me, was a policy book in the sense that it is absolutely a cautionary tale that I hope will rock people back. And, you know, someone asked me the other day, what should people feel when they finish the book, when they put down the book? And my answer to that is, I hope someone is reading that book in a picture window somewhere in a reading seat with a lot of light, and they look out that window and they put the book down and just look out the window at a garden or a young boy walking a dog by, or just life in a nice place. And I hope they say, life is pretty good. We can't lose that. We have to find a way to avoid what I just read about. So for me, it's very much a cautionary tale. Now, if you asked Elliot, and I've heard him answer this question, he always says, you know, for such a grim book, it was a lot of fun to write, and I think it's very entertaining. And sometimes he will talk about his own novels, and Elliot has written some brilliant, beautiful novels. He was a finalist for the National Book Award, one of the final 5, for example. And his books are quite dark. They challenge the reader deeply. Sometimes Elliot will say that he looks at 2034 the way Graham Greene looked at the difference between Graham Greene's, if you will, very serious novels, The Heart of the Matter, and Graham Greene's entertainments. Graham Greene called them entertainments. And for Elliot, believe it or not, 2034 is on the lighter side of what Elliot has written. So two kind of different perspectives, and I guess that's what you get when you have two writers who have come together to create a book.
Here's another question from one of our viewers about the process, and it's a good one. I know as a writer, I think any of us who tried writing know that there is this spontaneous process of creation, whether it's one person or two creating together. But then there's a different process that we sometimes forget about, which is the editing and revision process, where you are merciless with yourself and with your writing partner in cutting out things that don't work. And what interests me, and this is Robin asking the question, Robin asks, how did you handle revision? Did you and Elliot split up the suggested revisions, or did you both work on each other's suggestions? And surely there were moments where there was something you loved that Elliot didn't, and vice versa. How did you work that out?
Well, first of all, if people are not watching the PBS Hemingway series, stop everything you're doing and watch it. It's the Ken Burns description of Ernest Hemingway. It's a 6-hour Ken Burnsian epic. It's just so good. And a lot of the backstory you see there is revisions. And of course, Hemingway famously had 27 different endings for A Farewell to Arms, for example. And later in life, I don't think he has been perhaps as well served as he would have wanted in terms of what has been published posthumously from his, say, 800 pages about Africa, which came down to what we know today as True at First Light. I would say all of us want to be in a position to make those revisions ourselves. And so you feel for a craftsman like Hemingway, both in terms of not living long enough to really revise all of his own materials, and also his diminishment as he went along in his life. So a recommendation for those interested in the process of revision. But I would say, in terms of how Elliot and I handled it, he would suggest things, I would work on them, go back. I would suggest things, he would work on them and go back. Perhaps the thing I really wanted to include in the novel that didn't make, if you will, the final cut was another character who would have been Japanese. I think Japan is kind of strangely missing from the novel, and it's really a function of how difficult it is to tighten the frame of the story. When we get to 2054, the sequel, look for a major role, and I'll leave it at that.
Well, I will look forward to that. I'm like you. I'm a believer in the centrality of Japan in the story of the Pacific future. I think we too easily forget it. So, as I told Admiral Stavridis and the organizers, I'm going to have to end this session at 2:45 your time, 3:45 mine here in Washington, D.C. So I'm just going to ask one more question of Admiral Stavridis. It's going to be my own, because it's one of the things that I found most interesting in the book, both in a literary sense and also in a policy sense. And that is the danger that we experience with setting red lines. Red lines that then are crossed, that take us into territory that we wouldn't have wanted, sometimes couldn't have imagined, and is supremely dangerous. So let me ask you to close, Jim, by thinking just a little bit, both in terms of your book and your own experience as a commander, about when it's good to set red lines and when it's a terrible mistake.
I think it is very, very seldom do you want to establish a red line, because it then becomes a marker of credibility. So if you're going to say, Bashar al-Assad, if you use chemical weapons against your people, this is a red line. We will destroy your regime. We set that red line, perhaps not in precisely those words, and then we failed to do that. That is a red line failed that I think has hurt us, and the echoes of that continue. And I'm waiting for the second volume of Barack Obama's 2-volume memoir to see how he describes that story. So I think red lines, on the other hand, when used in very precise ways, can be helpful. And here avoid miscalculation. But see paragraph 1. If your opponent doesn't believe your red line, let's say in NATO context, a red line, my view, I think everyone's view, would be if Soviet military crossed a border of a NATO nation in anger. That is a massive red line. I believe it would provoke a massive response from the alliance. And Vladimir Putin, as tempted as he is from time to time, I think, and looks at the Baltics, I don't think he would dare cross a NATO border in anger. He has done so to Ukraine, and this, of course, is why he is adamant that Ukraine will never be part of NATO. Ukraine, David, would be an example of where we probably don't want to establish a red line, for example. We'll close on this because a salient point is Taiwan. And we have had this policy of strategic ambiguity for decades. We don't have time to unpackage what all that means, but I think there's a lively debate today about whether it's time to establish a red line about Taiwan. I would say be very, very careful.
Your moderator would agree with you. Folks, I want to just mention the book again, 2034 by Elliot Ackerman and our guest, Admiral James Stavridis. It's a marvelous read. It's scary as can be, and I hope people will order it, find their way to a bookstore. So glad to have this time with you, Jim. I look forward to talking again soon. Thanks, everybody, for watching.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.